Obama says a Britain out of Europe would be at the back of the queue. The president said he wasn't here to fix the vote, but on security, peace and trade, his stance was clear.
The United Kingdom is at its best when it's helping to lead a strong Europe.
Also tonight, guilty of 2 murders, the teenager obsessed with the Yorkshire Ripper.
Huge fines ahead for the owners of Alton Towers who accept blame for the Smiler Ride tragedy. And
to be or not to be? That is the question.
These children and a Time Lord on the 400th anniversary of the death of the Bard.
This is the ITV Evening News with Alistair Stewart and Charlene White.
good evening. In a carefully crafted answer to our deputy political editor, President Obama delivered a blockbuster of a message on the European referendum. Britain out would be less safe and less prosperous. He even said that we would be left at the back of the queue rather than the Americanism back of the line, to leave his UK audience in no doubt.
Boris Johnson, a leader of the Leave campaign, accused the president of hypocrisy, asking the UK to accept a loss of sovereignty the US would never accept. He blamed Obama's part Kenyan heritage for his antagonism. From Westminster, here's our political correspondent, Romilly Weeks.
The President arrived on the Queen's lawn in his own helicopter, Marine One, flown over for the occasion, to the most personal of welcome parties, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, braving the cold to greet their guests. There was some confusion over who would sit where in the Royal Range Rover. The Obamas, who'd taken the precaution of bringing their own 11-car cavalcade, probably didn't foresee they'd have the Duke himself as chauffeur.
No, this room is full of mirrors. Where would you like us?
The President might have come here with a message on Europe to deliver, but not before birthday greetings to the Queen. And in a measure of how warm this particular relationship is, their first engagement was lunch for just the 4 of them. The pleasant part over, the President arrived in Downing Street in presidential style. And there was no hiding the Prime Minister's delight his close ally was here to back him up in his hour of need. On the subject of Europe, Mr. Obama said it was his duty as a friend of the UK to speak out.
The United States wants a strong United Kingdom as a partner. And the United Kingdom is at its best when it's helping to lead a strong Europe.
Mr. President, Leave campaigners have said that you're acting hypocritically. America would not accept the loss of sovereignty that we have to accept as part of the EU. And therefore, in various degrees of politeness, they have said to you that you should really keep your views to yourself.
Well, first of all, let me repeat. This is a decision for the people of the United Kingdom to make.
And then the President dropped this bombshell on the Leave campaign's hope that America would fast-track a trade agreement with the UK if we left Europe.
Maybe some point down the line there might be a UK-US trade agreement, but it's not going to happen anytime soon because our focus is in negotiating with a big bloc, the European Union, to get a trade agreement done. And UK is going to be in the back of the queue.
Boris Johnson, who in a newspaper article today referred to the American president as part Kenyan and suggested he might have an ancestral dislike of the British Empire, did indeed call the president's intervention hypocrisy.
It is very odd, it is perverse, it is hypocritical for us to be told by America to embroil ourselves ever more deeply in a structure which would be absolutely alien to American tradition.
Intervening in another country's politics is always a tricky manoeuvre. The president went full throttle today. In doing so, he was at pains to emphasise he felt he was also representing America's best interests. But it was exactly what his old friend wanted to hear. Romilly Weeks, ITV News.
Well, the president's comments clearly haven't been welcomed by the Leave campaign, and an exclusive ITV News poll suggests you think he should keep his views to himself as well.
More than half said that Mr Obama should not publicly comment on the EU referendum. Our correspondent Dan Rivers has been gauging opinion in Plymouth, where the Pilgrim Fathers set sail for North America from an unfriendly Europe nearly 400 years ago.
It might not be on the president's itinerary this time, but for many other visiting Americans, a trip to Britain has to include a stop here. Plymouth's Mayflower Steps, where the first English separatists set sail for a new life in the New World.
So 400 years after the Pilgrim Fathers decided to opt out of England, how do people here feel about an American president coming back to tell us not to opt out of Europe?
Where better to ask than a classic diner just across the Tamar?
Is that my sweet chilli with the mayo?
Yes.
Customers here love the all-American food, but not the serving of opinion dished out today by President Obama.
I think he's got a bit of a cheek, to be honest with you. I mean, Americans are very proud of their sovereignty, and I think we are in this country as well. If you were to ask the American people, would they like to be run by South America? Would they like their government to be in Venezuela? And would they like the Mexican border opened up to Mexicans to come up? I think there'd be civil war.
It should be up to the British people to decide, not the American president. But personally, I think we should come out anyway.
Yeah, I definitely think he should stay out of it, yeah.
Why?
I mean, well, he's not even, it's not nothing to do with him. Europe's nothing to do with him, is it?
But not everyone here is so dismissive of the president's advice.
I think, yeah, we should stay in the EU, we should listen to President Obama. He knows what he's talking about.
Opinions here roughly mirror findings of a new poll for ITV News. Before he arrived in Britain, 60% said President Obama's opinion was not important to them. 30% said it was. And when asked whether he should or should not publicly comment on Britain's membership of the EU, just over half said he should not, with just over a third saying he should. There's just over 2 months to chew over his intervention and decide whether we should listen to the United States when choosing whether to remain united with Europe. Dan Rivers, ITV News, Plymouth.
And our deputy political editor, Chris Shipp, rejoins us live now. Chris, you asked the question, you got the answer. How damaging was it for the Leave side?
Well, Alistair, you know, when US presidents come to this country, they don't do things by half. They arrive on the biggest aeroplane, they drive about in the biggest convoys, and they bring with them the biggest press packs. And so it was that President Obama entered our hotly contested EU referendum debate in a very big way. He could have, for example, tiptoed around this subject. He could have found a very diplomatic form of words to say, look, this isn't mine, it's your decision, you go ahead and take it. Instead, he did what he could, I think, to completely demolish the claim by the Leave campaign in general and Boris Johnson in particular that outside the EU we'd be able to build all sorts of new trade relationships around the world. One of those relationships would be with the US of A. We'd increase our share of trade with the US. And President Obama said at that lectern just behind me, well, I gather you might want to hear from the president what he thinks about this. And that's when he delivered, I think, that devastating line, you would go to the back of the queue. Note, as you did, Alistair, he said back of the queue, not back of the line, which rather suggests this was orchestrated, but he knew exactly what he was doing here.
Chris, thank you.
A teenager obsessed with the Yorkshire Ripper has been found guilty of murdering 2 strangers in frenzied knife attacks. James Fairweather, who was just 15 years old at the time, stabbed one of his victims 100 times. He wanted to become a serial killer and was caught as he was hunting for a 3rd victim. Sejal Karia reports.
He looks like an ordinary teenager, but he is a schoolboy killer. James Fairweather murdered 2 strangers in Colchester when he was just 15. A boy obsessed with the Yorkshire Ripper and fixated with serial killers, who kept graphic books and DVDs about notorious murders. In a police interview after his arrest and throughout his trial, he claimed voices in his head were commanding him to kill.
Some voices were talking to me, you need to make a sacrifice or we're going to come and get you, you need to do it.
James Atfield, a dad of 5, was his first victim, a vulnerable man who'd been left brain damaged after a car accident. He'd been in a pub drinking on the night he was murdered. Hours afterwards, Fairweather stabbed him more than 100 times in a secluded park, a ferocious attack that even shocked police. Outside court today, James's mum Julie stood at the side of a police officer who spoke on her behalf.
We had no idea the killer was so young, a fact that makes my son's death feel all the more cruel and unnecessary.
Nahid Al-Manea was his next victim. Wearing a veil, she was caught on CCTV walking to university just minutes before she was killed. She'd only arrived in the UK from Saudi Arabia 6 months earlier. Miss Al-Manea was found by a passerby on this quiet footpath close to her university. She was lying on the ground, having been stabbed 16 times. But it was nearly a year before her killer was caught. Chillingly, very close to this spot. Police believe he was looking for his next victim. Fairweather was only arrested by chance after a dog walker reported him acting suspiciously. It was only luck that stopped this schoolboy from becoming a serial killer. Sejal Karia, ITV News, Colchester.
The mystery surrounding the death of music legend Prince deepened tonight after it emerged emergency crews were told of an unresponsive male on his private jet last week.
The 57-year-old star was found dead in a lift at his Minnesota home yesterday. And as Duncan Golestani reports today, there have been more tributes from fellow musicians, fans and family.
The sister of Prince was among the many thousands who have come to his home to pay their respects.
Thank you for loving him, y'all. Oh. And he loved each and every one of you.
Across the city where he grew up and never really left, crowds turned out to celebrate the life and music of Prince. At the First Avenue Club in Minneapolis, the setting for Purple Rain, fans sang and danced through the night. While at the home where Prince died, the mood was more reflective.
I just want to pay respects to him, you know, for all the things he did in the past as far as his music was concerned that he gave to the world.
Mystery surrounds Prince's final few days alive. Last week, his plane made an emergency landing with reports of an unresponsive male on board. The cause of the performer's death at his home will not be known until a post-mortem is completed. For now, fans and peers are paying tribute to an artist whose influence crossed generations and musical boundaries.
The marriage of his love for music, the marriage of his love for humankind, the marriage of his love for equality. He did not ever allow his dreams to be put to sleep based on fear.
Sales of Prince's albums have surged overnight, his music once again dominating the charts. It is thought his home is full of unreleased songs. If made public, it would be a musical treasure trove for generations to come. Duncan Golestani, ITV News.
Still to come on the ITV Evening News, victims of the Alton Towers disaster in court to hear the company plead guilty to breaching health and safety laws.
And the time traveller and why Shakespeare's death 400 years ago still matters. Those stories and more after the break. Welcome back. A British oil worker who was held hostage for 18 months by Al-Qaeda has told ITV News how he feared he'd be beheaded and never see his family again. Speaking for the first time about what happened, Bob Semple said he'd mentally said farewell to his wife and children. He was captured as he made his usual journey to work in the Yemeni capital Sana'a in February 2014 and was finally rescued 565 days later by Special Forces soldiers. Bob told our reporter Sally Lockwood about his harrowing ordeal.
One with a knife stabbed me, another one started clubbing me over the head with his pistols. I'd be asleep and I could feel the chain on my leg. 10 million? Who's going to pay 10 million for me?
Kidnapped in Yemen by Al-Qaeda, chained and locked in a cell for 19 months. This is the first time Bob Semple has spoken of his ordeal.
I was less than 100 metres from the office when a taxi cab pulled in front to stop the car and these guys with guns jumped out. One with a knife stabbed me, another one started clubbing me over the head with his pistols. And then when I was semi-conscious, they bundled me into another truck.
A family man, it was Bob's 14-year-old son who received the phone call from the Foreign Office that he'd been kidnapped. His family heard nothing for 6 months until Bob's captors forced him to call home, demanding $10 million.
Once I'd made that telephone call, I knew now what they wanted. And I mean, 10 million? Who's going to pay 10 million for me? Nobody. So I just wrote myself off then.
My name is Bob Semple. I'm a British subject working in Yemen.
During his captivity, Bob was forced to make several videos. His greatest fear was showing emotion.
My real worry about the videos and that was that they would actually video me getting my head chopped off. And I would break down at that point.
Adding to his wife's fears was financial worry, and she was forced to sell the family home. Bob had previously served in the army, and the Soldiers' Charity came to her support. For Bob, it was former hostage Terry Waite who gave him hope at his lowest point.
They gave me the television because there was no electricity. And then really, really down in the dumps, suddenly the television burst into life. Electric came on and Terry Waite was on the news.
What did you think when you saw Terry Waite?
And I thought, well, stop being a wuss. He did 4 years.
Against all expectation, Bob was rescued by UAE Special Forces.
A hand came around my wrist, and he said, "You're safe now." Well, I didn't actually believe I was safe until I saw the Black Hawk came down and picked me up.
And he's now readjusting to the life he thought he'd lost. Sally Lockwood, ITV News.
2 men have been jailed for life for an Islamic State-inspired plot to kill soldiers and police officers on the streets of London. Students Tariq Hussain and Sahab Majid will serve at least 20 years each for conspiracy to murder and preparing acts of terrorism.
Culture Secretary John Whittingdale is being investigated by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards for not declaring a trip he made to the MTV Awards in Amsterdam in 2013 with his then-girlfriend.
The owner of Alton Towers is facing a massive fine after admitting breaching health and safety laws over an accident which saw 2 young women lose their legs. The court heard the victims were left in indescribable pain and had their lives turned upside down after the crash on the Smiler last summer. As Ben Chapman reports, some of those hurt watched the hearing today.
They boarded a roller coaster and came off with life-changing injuries. Today, finally, the victims of the Alton Towers crash had their day in court and heard the park's owners admit they didn't do enough to keep people safe. These new pictures show the mangled carriage that smashed into a stationary one. The crumpled metal bumper crushed the legs of those in the front row, leaving 2 young women with amputations. Outside court, their solicitor said the guilty plea was some comfort.
Today was certainly not about retribution, but it was a very important step, a psychological milestone along the recovery route. The physical injuries will last forever.
The Smiler ride wasn't as safe as it could have been from the day it opened to the day of the crash. Alton Towers had previously said it was caused by human error, but the court was told there was not a good enough system for staff operating the ride. A carriage stuck on the track would show on a computer, but staff didn't see it. The result was an attendant overrode the lock on the computer system, allowing 2 cars to collide. Chanda Chauhan was on the ride with her 2 daughters and needed surgery for a torn liver. She told me today's plea is an empty gesture.
They have been pleaded guilty, and rightfully so. But what are they going to do about it? And at the moment, I don't think they're doing enough. Especially because I think we are like the forgotten people.
The Smiler reopened last month. Alton Towers insists it is now safe and says it will continue to support the victims. But when they all return to court for sentencing, the park's owners could face a fine running into millions. Ben Chapman, ITV News, Staffordshire.
And finally tonight, two of Britain's most celebrated actors have told ITV News it's vital that children see Shakespeare performed live to ensure his legacy lives on. Both David Tennant and Dame Judi Dench say that when his plays are done live, his words come alive.
Events indeed are being held across the country this weekend to mark the 400th anniversary of the Bard's death and birth, as it happens. From Stratford-upon-Avon, Nina Nannar reports.
At the church where 400 years ago Shakespeare was buried, they were honouring him today.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
Hello, Greg. Nice to see you. Hi, David.
Hi.
Thanks for breaking off from rehearsals.
While across town at the home of the Royal Shakespeare Company, two of its leading lights are rehearsing for a show tomorrow night to celebrate the Bard, a writer who can be understood by old and young, they say.
The plays were written to be performed, and that's when the meaning, which can seem archaic, which can seem 400 years old when you first experience it in black and white on a page, can sparkle and can spark when you see it in performance. And you don't have to necessarily understand what every single word means.
Because we've now been filming every Shakespeare we did since David did Richard II, and now we stream those into schools for free, and the kids in the classrooms then get online and ask us questions.
More than 1 million school children have taken part in Shakespeare Week celebrations, like this school in Birmingham, where children are given their first taste of the Bard's work.
My favourite play would have to be A Midsummer Night Dream, and I love comedy a lot, and it was very funny and lots of wacky stuff in it.
Mine has to be Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, it has to be.
Opening an exhibition of the Bard's first collected edition of plays, renowned Shakespearean Dame Judi Dench agrees the stories should appeal to the young.
There's nothing so exciting as children being really caught by a story, because they're all things we know about. Love and fright and envy and greed.
What is clear is that leading actors continue to queue up to speak his words on the stage.
20 years now I've been working with the Royal Shakespeare Company. It's a very alarming prospect. And I'm only 27 now, so I don't quite understand.
He must have forgotten when the Bard wrote The Truth Will Out. Nina Nannar, ITV News in Stratford-upon-Avon.
And that's it. Tom's here at 10.
But that's it from us. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.